Chapter 5, verse 3, the first beatitude, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Hi, this is the Thinking Biblically podcast. I'm Dr. Mike Stallard with the Friends of Israel. Our purpose here is to help simplify issues of theology. And so today we want to talk about the issue of the kingdom. It's going to give an overview of the doctrine of the kingdom and the word kingdom as it occurs in the Bible. But before we get into the details of the actual positions about the kingdom and the meanings of the word and how it's used, I want to talk about four different views with respect to time. And that comes into play and affects a lot of people in terms of how they view the timing of the kingdom, or the timing of this aspect of the kingdom, etc. So it comes into play. And these four views with respect to time are pretty simple. One is Preterism, which is past. One is Historicism, which is present. One is Futurism, which is future. One is Idealism, which is timeless. So we want to look at each of these four briefly and talk about them. A preterist is someone who looks at all of the prophecies in the Bible concerning what a dispensationalist would consider end-time prophecies. A preterist would look at those, Book of Daniel, Book of Revelation, the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24 and 25, and other prophetic passages, would look at those as already fulfilled. There's different variations in preterism, but one is that it's fulfilled like the Olivet Discourse, fulfilled in AD 70 when the Roman soldiers came and destroyed the temple and Jerusalem by the Roman armies. And they would see Jesus coming in the Roman army to destroy Israel in fulfillment of the prophecies of Matthew 24 and 25. Historicism is the view that, associated with the word present, that's the view that the person who holds that view believes he's living inside the bubble of fulfillment. So there's this time of fulfillment, and he's living inside of it. Oftentimes, you take the tribulation stuff in the book of Revelation from chapter 6 to 19, and you place yourself somewhere in there on the timeline of our history. Jonathan Edwards was one of those who actually did that. It was probably the most common view in church history, has been the most common view in church history. But Jonathan Edwards would map out some of the seals and the trumpets and the bowl judgments. He mapped those out to people like Luther and Calvin, Zwingli, some other John Huss, and other people throughout history. He sees different events taking place, and he mapped those things. And of course, he was living inside of that. And he saw the fulfillment in the future to his time of kingdom, but he was living inside the lead up to that, and so his view would be called historicist. A futurist is someone who looks at the Olivet Discourse, all the Old Testament prophets and their promises about the kingdom, and the promises about the tribulation period, and the promise in the book of Revelation, all of those things as something that will take place in the future. And a dispensationalist, if he is consistent, is a futurist. All those things are for a time in the future. If there is a dispensationalist who maps current events to specific Bible passages, he may be violating the idea that he's a futurist. But little interpretation leads to a futurism, in my opinion. Idealism is someone again, who's not looking at the prophecies in any time sense. For example, someone might look at the book of Revelation and say it's just, the chapter 6 to 19, the tribulation stuff, is just talking about trouble in the life of a Christian no matter where he is in history. That would be an idealist. So people who have a bent relative to those kinds of things might be affected by how they read the text. Now, I want to get into the various views of the kingdom, in particular the timing of the kingdom. It's more than just the timing of the kingdom, though, although that's the main point that the terms indicate. But it also goes to the nature of the kingdom. And so I wanted to highlight the general outline of various views along these lines. And we'll spend more time in future episodes about each of these in a little more detail. The first view is amillennialism. The A on the front of millennial is a negative, alpha privative, means no millennium. Now, the word millennium comes to us from Revelation chapter 20, where 6 times the term 1,000 years is mentioned, and millennium is Latin for 1,000 years. And to put an A on the front of the term, amillennial, means no millennium. Now, again, that's a bit of a misnomer, because those who are amillennial do believe that Revelation 20, the 1,000 years, is talking about something, but it's talking about the present church age. So they don't deny a millennium. What they deny is a future millennium, like a dispensationalist would look at a future coming of Christ for a millennium, or a postmillennialist would have a version of a millennium as well. But amillennialists see the church age as the millennium, and the church basically gets identified with the kingdom. So it's not the world at large that's the kingdom. It's generally, for most amillennialists, it's the church that is the kingdom on earth. Now, postmillennialism is a view, by the way, the amillennial view goes back, begins to be popularized in the 3rd century. I would say this to my amillennial friends, that their view actually owes more to Plato than it does the Bible. Plato was idealistic, and so the idea of as Platonic thought rose up in the culture of the 2nd century, and there's kind of a Greek revival of that. And Gnosticism came in as well, which dovetailed nicely with that, where all literal concrete things were kind of evil. So the world is evil, and so if you have a concrete earthly kingdom like the Jews had expected, then that's evil. And so that was rejected in terms of a more spiritual kingdom in the heart idea, or Christ reigning over the church idea, a more mystical idea. That was acceptable under Platonic thought. So I would say the amillennialists owe more to Plato than they do the actual Bible. The Hebrew thought pattern is a lot more concrete, so earthly things are to be expected. Postmillennialism, on the other hand, doesn't arise early like amillennialism does in church history. In fact, I'm not sure that I see it before the 1600s. It certainly comes after the Reformation. Daniel Whitby is considered the founder of modern postmillennial thinking. And in this view, the kingdom is something that is not identified with the church, but the church ushers in the kingdom by its success at evangelizing, and its success at Christianizing culture. And so when enough of that is done, Jesus will come back at the end of that period of time as kind of a reward for the church's good work. Now, it's probably true that the early postmillennialists were literal about the 1,000 years, and so that the 1,000 years should be taken a straightforward way, just like a dispensationalist would take the 1,000 years. Today, most postmillennialists probably do not take it as a literal 1,000 years, but as an indefinite period of time. That's also true of amillennialists, who take the 1,000 years as an indefinite period of time. It's especially hard to take the 1,000 years as a literal period of time for an amillennialist. The church age is the kingdom, since we've gone past the year 1,000, so they have to do something with that. Premillennialism, on the other hand, is grounded in the early church because it's in the text of the Bible, in my opinion. Premillennialism is the belief that the Messiah is coming back to earth before the millennium to set up the millennium, and it requires the personal presence of the Messiah to do so. And so we believe that Jesus is coming back to set up that kingdom. Now, there are a couple kinds of premillennialism. One is called historic or classical premillennialism. Those who call themselves that do so because they believe it's the historic position of the early church. They typically are non-dispensational and often do not have a future for national Israel. So they tend to emphasize New Testament, Revelation 19 and 20, and the Jesus coming back in 19, and in chapter 20 you have the millennium. So they tend to emphasize that, but not the Old Testament prophets. Well, there's variations in that, though we have to be careful not to have a broad brush stroke over everyone. And then, of course, there's dispensational premillennialism, and we are dispensationalists here at the Friends of Israel. And we have a Zionist outlook. We believe in the future of national Israel, that Jesus is coming back to set up a kingdom centered, headquartered in Israel, not in Washington, D.C., or Paris, or London, or anywhere else, but in Jerusalem on planet Earth. And the kings of the earth come up to Jerusalem to worship the Lord. So we see that kind of approach to the timing of the millennium. And of course, in that approach, you think through, amillennialism has a more mystical approach to the nature of the kingdom. Postmillennialism sees the kingdom on earth in a political sense. Premillennialism also does it, but has a different timing aspect. And we have a more Jewish nature to premillennialism. So these various views impact how you view the nature of the kingdom, not just the timing of the kingdom. Now, with that said, all of this is introduction. The four views with respect to time, these three views with respect to the timing of the kingdom, which affect nature. How does the Bible itself use kingdom language? And again, this is just an overview, and I want to highlight several things. And what I want to do is make sure that we don't see biblical terms always as technical terms. I see that mistake happen all the time. I was at a recent conference and spoke, and that question came up during a Q&A time. People falsely doing that, and it leads to bad decisions in terms of the exegesis of some particular passage of the Bible. So the word kingdom is not something that everywhere you see the word kingdom, it means exactly the same thing. Now, in a general sense, it means somebody's ruling over something. That's fine. We can take that as a general idea, but it doesn't always refer to the same kingdom or the same nature of things. So from the vantage point of biblical understanding of kingdom, I start in Genesis chapter 1. And we see the first reference to God's rule mentioned in his creation of man. In chapter 26, verse 26 of chapter 1, then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So here, God, in the image of God, makes man in his image. Now, what is that? It uses the word likeness. The Greek translation uses the word icon, statue. It is interesting that you don't find in the archaeological ruins of Israel, you don't find any statues to Yahweh. That seemed to be one of the commandments that they kept, making no idols, no statues, not even of false gods, but of the one true and living God. They weren't to make statues of him. And I think one of the reasons of that may be that he already has his statues. That's us. That's human beings. We are his statues representing him in the world. But also not just that stand in for us, that we represent him, and I think we represent him morally and represent him in our thinking capacity rationally, based on other passages. But we also represent God in terms of a reflection of him in terms of relationships. Because in verse 27, so God created man in his own image, in the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. And I think the point there is not that God has a male side and a feminine side. The point is that he has relationships. Not only is man made in the image of God in terms of his likeness, being the statuette of God in terms of morality and thinking and other things, not only is he reflecting God in terms of his relational capacity, but he also reflects the sovereignty of God by his ruling on the earth. Notice in these passages that he has said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over everything in verse 26. And verse 28, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea. And the language there in Hebrew is very strong language for man's rulership over everything. Back in my aerospace engineering days, I had a guy visit my cubicle one time, sat down to talk, and he was a member of the Sierra Club, very much into the environmental movement. And he looked at me and he knew I was a Christian and going to seminary, and he said, "You Christians are the reason we have pollution." And I'd heard Christians accused of a lot of things, but to that point in my life, I had never heard of Christians being the reason for pollution. And he said, yeah. And I said, I'd like to hear why you think that. And he gave me two reasons. The first reason he gave me was this passage. He says, you have this passage, and this passage gives you permission to rape planet Earth, to abuse planet Earth. And his second reason was, you believe in the second coming of Jesus. And so you don't have to fix anything. You're sitting on your hands waiting for Jesus to come to fix everything. And so he used that misrepresentation of us, in both cases, to accuse us of being the reason why we have pollution. But this is a very strong passage, and we can't devalue it at all. But man was made to rule this planet. God placed us here for that purpose. Satan has usurped that role. He's now the prince and power of the air. And there's this struggle between man and Satan for who controls this planet. And the purpose that God has throughout history, throughout the dispensations, is to eventually bring us back to where man, under God and his plan, again has the right to rule the planet under God. So we see that as the starting point. Now, out of that, we can say there are some ways that the idea of kingdom and this rulership through history is expressed. Number one is just God's sovereignty in general over all things in heaven and on earth. And that means everything. Over animals, a sparrow doesn't fall to the ground without the Lord knowing. All the things we can walk through the scriptures and see that God's in control of. But in particular, I want to highlight his providential control of nations. And there are a few passages I just thought we would go take a look at. First one is in Daniel. In Daniel chapter 4. This is a chapter where Nebuchadnezzar, the great king of Babylon, is brought very, very low. He's made almost like an animal. Some give it a name, some kind of disease where he acts like an animal, goes insane for a while, and then he's brought back after his humiliation. And it's interesting, verse 34, and at the end of the time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes, I'm in Daniel 4, I lifted my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me, and I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. And here's the key section, for his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation, and all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. No one can restrain his hand or say to him, what have you done? So this is a reference to the providential control of nations that Nebuchadnezzar recognizes after God has restored him. And in Jeremiah 1:10, Jeremiah is told that God's putting words in his mouth. See, I have this day set you over the nations and over the kingdoms, to root out and to pull down, to destroy and to throw down, to build and to plant. It is God who raises and puts down the kingdoms. And then one more passage in the same vein is in Habakkuk. Habakkuk is probably my favorite minor prophet. And in the very first chapter, Habakkuk is complaining. God, all the sin that I'm looking around me in my nation, and you're not doing anything about it. And God says, you don't understand. I'm already doing something about it in verse 5. And here's what he's doing about it, verse 6. For indeed I am raising up the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, a bitter and hasty nation, which marches through the breadth of the earth, and they're terrible and they're dreadful. He goes on and describes them. He's raising them up to come judge Judah. And I don't think Habakkuk is happy with his answer. I'm already doing something about your sin of your nation. I'm raising up the Babylonians to judge you. Now, this is God, and it's interesting, God raising up a nation to judge another nation. He's raising up evil people to judge a less evil people in Judah. That's interesting. Could God raise up an evil empire like China or Iran or Russia to judge an evil United States? God could do that if he chose. And this is God raising them up. It's very deliberate on his part. Now, that raises the question, is God in his sovereignty being sinful? And the answer is no. God is just directing the sinful propensity that nations have and people have in those nations and leaders have, and turning it and causing it to carry out a plan of his for the good of his own people. And so God is doing that. So he is sovereignly, providentially in control of the nations. And of course that includes Israel and Judah, as we've seen here. Sometimes God's plan with Israel in history, providentially, is referred to as the theocratic kingdom, because you remember at one point in time, God wanted to rule over Israel without them having a king. But eventually they got King Saul. Things didn't work out so well, and so God raised up David, and the plan goes on, and they have a king, which ultimately will lead to the King Messiah, Jesus Christ, when he comes back on the earth to sit on the throne of David. And so there is that theocratic God ruling idea that's in the Old Testament and sometimes applied to all of Israel's history, but really makes the most sense talking about the millennium that is to come. So the first use of the word kingdom in general in the Bible is God's sovereign control over all things in heaven and earth, especially his providential control of history. Second is Jesus' rule as head of the church. And of course, Jesus is God, so this is God ruling. We don't often refer to this as Jesus as king of the church, but the idea of king, prince, all the different terms that are used, we don't use that because it confuses people, but he is ruling. And we see this very clearly in Ephesians chapter 1. In verse 22, he put all things under his feet and gave him, Jesus, to be head over all things to the church, which is his body, the fullness of him who fills all in all. Then in Colossians, parallel passage in verse 18, and he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he may have the preeminence. So Jesus reigns over the church as head of the body. He's over the head of this body of Jews and Gentiles brought together. He is essentially the boss of the church. Now, this doesn't denigrate the idea of God's general sovereignty at all. It's just an expression of his general sovereignty, that in this age, in the church age, and on into eternity, Jesus is the head of the body. He's the head of the church. And God has designed this as one aspect of his sovereign rule in history. So we have God's general sovereignty over all things, and then we have Jesus' rule as head of the church. As a couple ways that rulership is expressed or kingship is expressed. The third one is the future messianic kingdom promised by the prophets centered in Israel. And this is the one where most of the debate happens. And in Zechariah chapter 14, we have a very interesting passage. It's 12, 13, and 14 kind of go together in Jeremiah, and we have the promise of the coming deliverance of Judah. It's an ultimate one. It's also a spiritual deliverance. Chapter 13, in that day a fountain shall be opened for the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and for uncleanness. There is salvation, not spiritual salvation, not just national salvation and deliverance. But there is that attack upon Jerusalem, chapter 14 of Zechariah, verse 1. Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, and your spoil will be divided in your midst, for I will gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem. I think this correlates somewhat to the battle of Armageddon in the book of Revelation. The city shall be taken, the houses rifled, the women ravished, half of the city shall go into captivity, but the remnant of the people shall not be cut off from the city. So there's a remnant, but there's also destruction. The city of Jerusalem, the people of Israel are being attacked. And then it says, verse 3, the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as he fights in the day of battle. And in that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west. And then you come down to verse 9, and it says this, at that time, and the Lord shall be king over all the earth. In that day it shall be, the Lord is one and his name one. There is no one else to worship, no false gods around anymore. The Lord shall be king over all the earth. But his headquarters, where did he come? He comes to Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Israel, at the center of it, but God comes back. And this is a future kingdom for Israel. This is something at the end of time. This is not something that happened in the past. It's not something that in any shape or form you can say is fulfilled already. This is a hard passage for the preterists to accept by any stretch of the imagination, because a preterist believes that God came back in 780 to destroy Israel, and Israel's gone. This passage speaks of an end-time day deliverance of Jerusalem and Israel. God comes back, Jesus comes back, the Messiah comes back. Everything in Zechariah building up the Messiah coming back. The Lord himself in the Messiah coming back to save Israel. And he rules not just over Israel, but as the text says, over all the earth. And so you see that passage. And then there's Isaiah 11, which is one of my favorite chapters in the book of Isaiah. It divides neatly into three parts. The first part is a picture of the Messiah in the kingdom, when the kingdom begins. He comes forth, a rod from the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. That's Messiah language. And the Spirit of the Lord will rest upon him, and he's going to rule with a rod of iron, talking about the millennium. And then you have the second section of the chapter talking about the renovation, the renewal of nature itself. And that's where you have the wolf dwelling with the lamb, the young lion dwelling with the calf. You have the nursing child playing by the cobra's hole, and the weaned child shall be put in his hand in the viper's den. So you have this beautiful picture of the restoration of nation. The beginning of it, I think, is ultimately fulfilled in the new heavens, new earth, but you see the beginning of it here. And then, beginning of verse 10, all the way to the end of the chapter, you have the restoration of Israel. The kingdom is brought back. It's Israel. And verse 12, he will set up a banner for the nations, will assemble the outcast of Israel, gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. And there's envy on the part of the others and obedience from them, and he will deliver them. And a highway is made for their salvation. So you have a clear, wonderful presentation of a future messianic kingdom in the end time days. And then in Daniel 7, I think you have what might be my favorite passage in the whole Bible concerning the future of the kingdom. In this chapter, you have four different kingdoms are described. They're described in terms of in visions describing animals. You have the lion with the eagle's wings. You have Babylon's Babylon. It correlates to chapter 2. You have Medo-Persia as a bear raised up on one side. Then you have Greece like a leopard. And all three of those are labeled in the book of Daniel very clearly: Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. And then the fourth beast, kind of a dreadful iron animal, which is probably Rome. In chapter 11 of Daniel, it highlights the fact that it mentions the word Katim, and Katim is translated in the Septuagint as Romans. And so probably this is correct. That's the next empire that comes on the scene. It's Rome. And out of that empire comes the little horn. And there's going to be a revived Roman Empire in the end time days. I take it in this passage. We don't have time to review that right now. But this fourth beast has a little horn or a little ruler come up. He's going to destroy others. And then he's going to go about with pompous words and boasting against God. And then you have and that's the Antichrist figure. And in verses 9 and 10, you have a pronouncement of judgment upon him from the Ancient of Days. And then he's destroyed. And verse 13 comes to play. I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man, this is the Messiah, coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed. And so the Messiah comes, the Son of Man comes, receives from the Ancient of Days the kingdom. When the Antichrist, this little horn, is destroyed. That fits Revelation chapter 19, points to the future, points to the second coming of Jesus. There's also passages like Ezekiel 40 to 48, where you have an outline of a temple and land allotments, Israel back in her land and kingdom, and the Messiah is there. And this character called David is there. We don't have time to go into that. But we also have passages like Psalm 89, where you have a promise of the Davidic covenant. The Davidic covenant will always take place. There's always going to be sons of Israel. There's always going to be a throne. Somebody can sit on the throne whenever God raises it up in history. And there's coming a time when someone's going to sit on that throne forever. Then we have Jeremiah 31, the new covenant, which the spiritual side of the deliverance of Israel in the end time days, while she's in her land for a forever kingdom. Then we have passages like Matthew 6:10 in the Sermon on the Mount, in the Lord's Prayer. Thy kingdom come, your kingdom come. It's a prayer for God's kingdom to come. It's not a kingdom that's already existing. He's praying for it to come. Luke 1:31, 35, we've talked some about that in past episodes, where Gabriel promises Mary that her son will rule over the house of Jacob, over the land there forever. There'll be no end to his kingdom. And then we have Revelation 19 to 22. Jesus comes back in chapter 19. And this is a deep thing theologically. 19 comes before 20. He comes back in 19, and 20 we have the 1,000 years, and he rules and reigns. And after the 1,000 years, God brings in the eternal state, the new heavens and new earth. And as Revelation 22:5 says, we will reign forever. All these beautiful passages talk about the reigning in the Messianic kingdom as a future thing that is brought to pass by God. Those passages do not refer to the church age in any shape or form. Revelation 20 does not refer to the church age. Revelation 21 and 22 does not refer to the church age. None of those Old Testament prophecies that we've talked about refer to the church age. They refer to the coming kingdom that God is going to bring to pass. So, when you kind of wade through all of that, the preponderance of biblical evidence suggests that the premillennial view of the kingdom is the right one. The Messiah is coming back to the earth to set up the earthly kingdom of God, which will last forever. And in future episodes, we're going to look at various passages that deal with the idea of kingdom in a little more detail, and we'll have fun doing that, because studying the Bible is one of the most fun things you can do if you're a believer in Jesus. But a lot of people disagree on these things, so when you study this out, be very cautious, be very careful, read the Bible carefully, and follow literal interpretation as we've taught you.